The earth trembled beneath 10,000 hooves, and the Roman sentries along the Danube frontier knew, in that primal moment, before rational thought could form, that their world was about to end. It was the spring of 441, and the man leading that thundering wave of horsemen across the plains had been born into a world that existed only to be conquered. His name would become synonymous with devastation, a word that mothers would whisper to quiet crying children for centuries after his bones had turned to dust. The Romans called him Flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God. History would know him as Attila. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The world into which Attila was born around the year 406 was one of endings and beginnings, a hinge point in human history when the ancient order was giving way to something new and terrible. The Roman Empire, that colossal edifice that had dominated the Mediterranean world for half a millennium, was fracturing. Not with a sudden catastrophic collapse, but slowly, like ice breaking up on a spring river, the cracks spreading year by year, century by century, until what had seemed eternal and immovable was revealed as merely temporary, merely human. Beyond the frontiers, in the vast grasslands that stretched from the borders of China to the edges of Europe, other forces were stirring. The Huns, Attila's people, had emerged from the steppes of Central Asia like a storm given human form. They were nomads, horse people whose entire culture revolved around mobility, warfare, and the bond between rider and mount. To the settled peoples of Europe and Asia, they seemed like demons, creatures that lived in the saddle, that could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop, that could traverse distances that should have been impossible, appearing where no army was expected, and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. The Huns had been pushing westward for generations before. Attila's birth driven by pressures from the east that historians can now only guess at drought, perhaps, or conflicts with other nomadic peoples, or simply the eternal hunger for better grazing lands and richer targets for plunder. Their arrival in Europe in the late 4th century had triggered a cascade of migrations and invasions. Germanic tribes, themselves fierce warriors, fled before the Hunnic advance, pouring across the Roman frontiers in desperate waves. The Goths, the Vandals, the Alans were set in motion by the Hunnic threat, and all in turn battered against the crumbling defenses of Rome. By the time Attila drew his first breath, the Huns had already established a formidable empire on the Hungarian plains, north of the Danube. They had forced numerous Germanic tribes into submission, creating a vast confederacy of peoples, united by Hunnic military power and the constant threat of Hunnic violence. They had fought both Roman empires. The Western Empire ruled from Ravenna, and the Eastern Empire governed from Constantinople, to a standstill, extracting tribute and concessions. They had gone from mysterious menace to established power in the span of a single generation. Attila was born into the Hunnic royal family, though what that meant in a nomadic society was different from Roman or Persian conceptions of royalty. The Huns had chiefs and sub-chiefs, clan leaders whose authority rested on their ability to lead warriors to victory and distribute plunder fairly. Attila's uncle Ruga had managed to consolidate power over multiple Hunnic clans, creating something approaching a centralized authority, but it was always a precarious position. Among the Huns, leadership had to be earned and re-earned through deeds, not merely inherited. Attila's father, Mundruk, was a chieftain of some importance, brother to King Ruga, but he died when Attila was young. The boy was raised in the traditional Hunnic way, learning to ride almost before he could walk, mastering the composite. Bow, that was the signature weapon of the steppe warriors, absorbing the values of courage, loyalty to one's band, and the absolute importance of reputation. Among the Huns, a warrior was nothing without his name, without the stories told of his deeds around the campfires. A man might be poor, might own nothing but his horse and his weapons, but if he had glory, he had everything. The young Attila grew up in a society that was remarkably different from the civilizations he would later terrorize. The Huns had no cities, no stone buildings, no written literature. They lived in felt tents that could be packed and moved in hours. Their wealth was measured in horses, in the tribute extracted from subject peoples, in gold and silk and other luxury goods taken in raids or received as diplomatic gifts. They had shamans rather than priests, believing in a sky god and various nature spirits. They practiced a form of divination involving the examination of animal bones and entrails. But to dismiss them as primitive would be a grave mistake, one that many Romans made to their cost. The Huns were masters of their environment, perfectly adapted to life on the steppes. Their military tactics were sophisticated and effective, honed by centuries of warfare on the Central Asian plains. They could execute complex maneuvers with thousands of horsemen, moving in coordinated attacks, feints, and retreats. They could maintain their mobility even in hostile territory by living off their herds and the lands they traversed. And they had developed a political system that, while different from Roman bureaucracy, was highly effective at mobilizing and directing the energies of their people. Attila had an older brother, Blada, and according to the limited sources available, the two were raised together, learning the arts of war and leadership side by side. When their uncle Ruga died around 434, the brothers inherited joint leadership of the Hunnic Confederation. This kind of dual kingship was not uncommon among nomadic peoples, where multiple capable leaders could share authority, at least temporarily. But it was also a system that contained the seeds of its own instability. The early years of Attila and Blada's joint rule were marked by aggressive expansion and diplomatic maneuvering. They immediately turned their attention to the Eastern Roman Empire, which had been paying tribute to the Huns for years, but was always looking for ways to reduce or eliminate those payments. In 435, the brothers met with Roman ambassadors at Margus, a city on the Danube, and negotiated a treaty that dramatically increased the tribute Constantinople was required to pay. The Treaty of Margus also stipulated that the Romans must return Hunnic fugitives who had sought refuge within the empire, must not form alliances with tribes hostile to the Huns, and must maintain open markets along the frontier where Huns could trade. This treaty is significant because it shows Attila, even in his early 30s, already operating as a sophisticated political actor, not merely a barbarian raider. He understood that the Eastern Roman Empire was wealthy, and that it was often easier and more profitable to extract gold through diplomacy and the threat of force than to actually wage war. The tribute payments were substantial 700 pounds of gold per year, equivalent to many millions of dollars in modern terms. This gold flowed into the Hunnic economy, was distributed to warriors and chieftains, and helped maintain the loyalty of subject tribes. It also allowed the Huns to purchase Roman luxury goods, weapons, and even to hire Roman craftsmen and engineers. But peace was always temporary when dealing with the Huns. In 440, claiming that the Romans had violated the Treaty of Margus by failing to return fugitives, and by the Bishop of Margus raiding Hunnic tombs on the north side of the Danube, Attila and Bleda launched a devastating invasion of the Balkans. The speed and ferocity of the Hunnic attack caught the Romans off guard. The Eastern Empire was already fighting a war against Persia and had weakened its European defenses. City after city fell to the Hunnic onslaught. Margus was sacked and destroyed. Singidunum, modern Belgrade, was taken. The Huns pushed deep into Roman territory, laying waste to a vast swath of the Balkans. The Romans, desperate to contain the disaster, pulled troops from the Persian front and finally managed to bring the Huns to battle. But even when they could force a pitched engagement, the Romans found themselves at a severe disadvantage. The Hunnic style of warfare, based on horse archers who could strike and retreat with incredible speed, was devastatingly effective against the more heavily armored but less mobile Roman forces. The Huns would unleash storms of arrows from a distance, breaking up enemy formations, and then charge in to finish off disorganized opponents. They avoided the kind of set-piece infantry battles that the Romans preferred, keeping their forces mobile and striking where the enemy was weakest. Contemporary accounts describe the terror that the Huns inspired. The Romano-Greek historian Priscus, who would later meet Attila in person, described the Huns as incredibly ugly, with deeply tanned skin, flat noses, and small eyes. He claimed they scarred their own faces deliberately to reduce beard growth and to toughen themselves. Whether these descriptions were accurate or merely Roman prejudice against foreign peoples is debatable. But what's clear is that the Huns appeared alien and terrifying to Mediterranean peoples. They wore animal skins, ate half-raw meat, and seemed to live on horseback. Roman propaganda portrayed them as barely human, as instruments of divine punishment for Roman sins. By 441, the Huns had captured multiple major cities and were threatening Constantinople itself. The Eastern Roman emperor, Theodosius II, was forced to sue for peace. The resulting treaty was humiliating for Rome. The annual tribute was tripled to 2,100 pounds of gold. A massive one-time payment of 6,000 pounds of gold was required. The Danube frontier was effectively abandoned, with the Romans agreeing to withdraw from a wide strip of territory. Any Roman fugitives among the Huns were to be ransomed at steep prices. This was the high point of the joint rule of Attila and Bleda. They had brought the Eastern Roman Empire to its knees and extracted unprecedented wealth. But the partnership between the brothers was not to last. Around 445, Bleda died under mysterious circumstances. The sources are vague and contradictory, but the implication is clear. Attila had him killed. Whether this was due to political disagreements, rivalry over power, or simply Attila's ambition, we cannot know for certain. What is certain is that after Bleda's death, Attila became the sole ruler of the Hunnic Empire, and it was under his sole leadership that the Huns would reach their greatest extent and pose the most serious threat to what remained of Roman civilization. With absolute power in his hands, Attila moved quickly to consolidate his authority and expand his domains. He was now in his early 40s, a seasoned warrior and leader who had spent decades learning the arts of war and politics. Unlike some conquerors who relied purely on force, Attila was shrewd, calculating, and capable of long-term strategic thinking. He understood that the Hunnic Empire needed more than just successful raids to survive. It needed structure, administration, and a continuous flow of wealth to keep his warriors satisfied and his subject peoples subdued. Attila established his capital on the Hungarian plains, probably somewhere in the region of modern Hungary. The palace, as the Romans called it, was more elaborate than a typical Hunnic camp, but still far from Roman standards of luxury. It consisted of large wooden buildings and was surrounded by the tents of the Hunnic elite. Here, Attila held court, received ambassadors, distributed plunder, and planned his campaigns. He lived relatively simply by royal standards. Priscus, who visited the palace in 449, noted that Attila ate from wooden plates while his guests dined off silver, and that his clothes, while clean and well-made, lacked the ornate decoration worn by his chieftains. This was deliberate projection of an image. Attila, as first among equals, a warrior king who shared the hardships of his men rather than a remote emperor living in luxury. But this should not be mistaken for weakness or lack of ambition. Attila was building a personality cult, establishing himself not just as a military leader, but as a figure of destiny. He reportedly claimed to possess the Sword of Mars, a legendary weapon that, according to Hunnic tradition, had been lost for centuries and whose wielder was destined to rule the world. Whether Attila actually believed this, or whether it was simply propaganda, is impossible to say, but it was effective. The discovery of this sword, conveniently found by a shepherd who brought it to Attila, reinforced his claim to supreme authority and gave a religious or mystical dimension to his rule. Under Attila's sole leadership, the Hunnic Empire reached its greatest territorial extent. At its height, it stretched from the steppes of Central Asia to the Rhine River, from the Baltic Sea to the Danube. This was not a unified state in the modern sense, but rather a collection of subject peoples held together by Hunnic military might and the constant threat of violence. Germanic tribes like the Gepids, Ostrogoths, Rugians, Syrians, Herals, and others served as vassals, providing warriors for Attila's armies. Some estimates suggest that the forces Attila could mobilize numbered in the hundreds of thousands, though the majority of these were not Huns, but subject peoples compelled to fight for their overlords. Managing this vast and diverse empire required more than just military prowess. Attila had to balance the competing interests of various tribes, distribute plunder fairly enough to prevent rebellion, and maintain the fear and respect that kept subject peoples obedient. He employed a system of hostages, taking the sons of subject chiefs to his court, ostensibly to be educated, but in reality to ensure their father's loyalty. He used divide and rule tactics, playing tribes against each other to prevent any coalition from forming against Hunnic dominance. And he was ruthless in crushing any hint of rebellion. Communities that resisted or betrayed the Huns were annihilated as examples to others. But Attila's gaze was increasingly drawn southward, toward the wealthy provinces of the Roman Empire. The Eastern Empire, having been thoroughly chastened by previous wars, was paying its tribute regularly. But the Western Roman Empire, weaker and more chaotic than its Eastern counterpart, presented opportunities. Unlike the East, which still maintained relatively effective military forces and administration, the West was fragmenting. Real power was in the hands of military strongmen and barbarian generals who nominally served the emperor, but often pursued their own agendas. The western provinces had been repeatedly invaded by Germanic tribes, some of whom had established their own kingdoms within imperial territory. Into this complex and volatile situation, Attila inserted himself with characteristic opportunism. In 449 or 450, he received a letter and a ring from Honoria, the sister of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III. Honoria had been forced into an unwanted betrothal to a senator, and in desperation or calculation, sent the ring to Attila with a plea for help. Whether this was intended as a marriage proposal or simply a request for intervention is unclear, but Attila chose to interpret it as the former. He immediately sent ambassadors to Ravenna, claiming that Honoria was his betrothed and demanding half of the Western Empire as her dowry. This was almost certainly a pretext rather than a genuine matrimonial concern, but it was a brilliant piece of political theater that gave Attila a quasi-legal justification for intervening in Western affairs. The Western Emperor, Valentinian, refused the demands, naturally, but Attila now had his casus belli. He began preparing for a massive invasion of Gaul. The decision to invade Gaul rather than Italy was strategic. Gaul was wealthy, relatively intact compared to other Western provinces, and politically fragmented. The Roman general Aetius, who effectively ruled the Western Empire during Valentinian's weak reign, was distracted by conflicts with various Germanic kingdoms. The Visigoths, who had established a kingdom in southwestern Gaul and Spain, were wavering in their loyalty to Rome. The Burgundians, Franks, and other tribes all had their own agendas. Attila saw an opportunity to exploit these divisions, perhaps to establish Hunnic dominance over Gaul, or at minimum to extract enormous amounts of plunder and tribute. In the spring of 451, Attila crossed the Rhine at the head of an enormous army. The exact numbers are impossible to determine. Ancient sources routinely exaggerated the size of armies, but it was certainly one of the largest forces assembled in the late antique period, possibly numbering over 100,000 warriors. This was not just a Hunnic army, but a multi-ethnic horde, including Ostrogoths, Gepids, Rugians, Syrians, Herals, Thuringians, Alans, Burgundians, and various other peoples. It was a moving nation complete with wagons, herds, and camp followers. The invasion of Gaul was conducted with the systematic brutality that had become Attila's trademark. Cities that resisted were stormed and destroyed. The population of Metz was reportedly massacred. Orleans was besieged, and only the timely arrival of a relief force saved it from falling. Attila's strategy was to move quickly, striking at multiple targets, keeping his enemies off balance and unable to concentrate their forces. He sent raiding parties in all directions, spreading terror and destruction, ensuring that no region felt safe from the Hunnic threat. But Attila had finally overreached. The invasion of Gaul succeeded in doing what years of Roman diplomacy had failed to accomplish. It united Romans as potential allies against a common threat. Aetius, the Western Roman general, who had actually spent time as a hostage at Attila's court in his youth and knew the Huns intimately, managed to forge a coalition. He brought together Roman forces, Visigothic warriors led by King Theodoric, Frankish tribes, Burgundians, and various other groups. The message was clear. If Attila was allowed to conquer Gaul, no one would be safe. For once, old rivalries and suspicions were set aside in the face of an existential threat. The two armies met on the Catalonian plains, near modern Troyes, in June of 451. This was one of the largest and most important battles of the ancient world, sometimes called the Battle of Chowens. Estimates of the total forces engaged range wildly, from 100,000 to 500,000, but the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. What's certain is that this was a clash of civilizations, a meeting of the nomadic steppe peoples and the remnants of Roman civilization, with the fate of Western Europe hanging in the balance. The battle lasted for hours, an immense and confused melee involving tens of thousands of warriors. Unlike earlier engagements, where the Huns had relied on mobility and archery, this was a direct confrontation. Attila placed his Huns in the center of his line, with his Germanic allies on the flanks. Aetius positioned his Roman forces on one wing, the Visigoths under Theodoric on the other, with less reliable allies in the center. The fighting was brutal and desperate. The Visigothic king Theodoric was killed in the battle, either trampled by cavalry or struck down in the press of combat. On both sides, thousands died in the summer heat, bodies piling up on the contested ground. As darkness fell, the battle remained unresolved, though most accounts suggest that Attila had gotten the worse of the exchange. He withdrew his forces to his fortified camp, encircled by wagons, and prepared for a final stand. According to some sources, he had a funeral pyre of saddles prepared, intending to burn himself alive rather than be captured if the camp was overrun. But Aetius did not press the attack. His motivations remain debated by historians. Perhaps he feared the cost of assaulting the Hunnic camp. Perhaps he was content with having checked Attila's advance. Or perhaps, more cynically, he wanted to preserve the Hunnic threat as a counterweight to the Visigoths and other potentially dangerous allies. Whatever the reason, Aetius allowed Attila to withdraw. The Huns retreated eastward, back across the Rhine. Their invasion of Gaul effectively ended. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains was not a decisive victory for either side in purely military terms. Both armies survived relatively intact, but strategically it was a turning point. Attila had been checked. The myth of Hunnic invincibility had been damaged. The Western Empire had demonstrated that it could still, when pressed, organize an effective defense. But Attila was not finished. In 452, perhaps seeking to restore his prestige, perhaps still pursuing his claim to Honoria, he invaded Italy. This was in some ways an even more audacious move than the invasion of Gaul. Italy was the heart of the Western Empire, the symbolic center of Roman power, and it was more heavily fortified than Gaul. But it was also war-weary and depleted, its armies stretched thin after the previous year's campaign. Attila crossed the Julian Alps and descended into the Po Valley. The city of Aquileia, one of the wealthiest and most important in northern Italy, stood in his path. When it refused to surrender, Attila besieged it. The siege lasted for months, with the defenders stubbornly resisting, despite being cut off from reinforcement. Finally, according to legend, Attila noticed storks abandoning their nests on the city walls, taking their young and flying away. He interpreted this as an omen that the city would fall and ordered a final assault. Aquileia was taken, sacked, and destroyed so thoroughly that it never recovered. The survivors fled to the lagoons off the coast, and their settlements would eventually grow into Venice. After Aquileia, other cities fell in rapid succession. Padua, Verona, Brescia, Bergamo all either surrendered or were taken by storm. Milan, the second city of Italy, opened its gates without resistance. Attila established himself in the imperial palace and reportedly sat on the throne, a symbolic gesture of triumph. The road to Rome lay open. The Western Emperor Valentinian had fled to Ravenna, protected by its marshes and fortifications. Aetius had an army somewhere in Italy, but he was apparently unable or unwilling to confront Attila directly. At this point, with Attila seemingly poised to march on Rome itself, something unexpected happened. He stopped. A delegation from Rome, led by Pope Leo I, traveled north to meet with Attila and negotiate. The historical sources are frustratingly vague about what exactly transpired at this meeting, held near Mantua. Later Christian tradition would claim that Pope Leo convinced Attila to spare Rome, through the power of his moral authority, perhaps, backed by divine intervention, that Attila saw visions of Saints Peter and Paul threatening him with death if he continued. The reality was almost certainly more prosaic. Attila's army, after more than a year of continuous campaigning, was exhausted. Disease had broken out in the camps, possibly malaria or dysentery, both common in the Italian summer. Supply lines were stretched. The Eastern Roman Empire, seeing its western counterpart in extremis, was stirring and might attack Hunnic territories, while Attila was tied down in Italy. And Rome itself, while symbolically important, was no longer particularly wealthy. It had been sacked by the Visigoths in 410, and much of its portable wealth had already been looted. A siege would be long and costly, and even if successful, what would it gain him? So Attila accepted whatever terms were offered: tribute, concessions, recognition of his claims, and withdrew from Italy. He crossed back over the Alps and returned to his capital on the plains, having ravaged northern Italy, but not achieving a decisive victory. It was to be his last campaign. In 453, Attila took a new wife, a young woman named Ildico, and held a great feast to celebrate the marriage. He was now in his late 40s or early 50s, a great age for a warrior who had spent his entire life in the saddle and in combat. That night, Attila retired to his chamber with his new bride. The next morning, when he failed to appear, his guards finally broke down the door and found him dead, lying in a pool of blood. Ildico was found terrified and weeping, unable or unwilling to explain what had happened. The exact cause of death remains one of history's mysteries. The official account, as reported by Priscus, who heard it secondhand, was that Attila suffered a severe nosebleed, possibly due to excessive drinking at the wedding feast, and choked on his own blood while lying unconscious. It's a plausible explanation. Alcohol-induced hemorrhage is certainly possible, especially in someone who had lived a hard life. But suspicions of foul play were immediate and have never entirely gone away. Could Ildico have killed him? Could political enemies within the Hunnic court have arranged his death? The truth died with those who were there. What is certain is that Attila's death was catastrophic for the Hunnic Empire. He had held together a vast and fractious coalition of peoples through force of personality, military success, and the constant flow of plunder. Without him, there was no one with the authority or ability to maintain that unity. His sons, numerous from his many wives, immediately fell to fighting over the succession. Helic, apparently Attila's favorite, tried to claim supreme authority, but his brothers refused to accept his leadership. The subject peoples saw their opportunity. The Germanic tribes, particularly the Gepids, rose in rebellion. In 454, barely a year after Attila's death, a massive battle took place at the Battle of Nedao in Pannonia. The Hunnic forces, now divided and led by Attila's feuding sons, were decisively defeated. Elec was killed in the fighting. The Hunnic Empire, which had seemed so formidable just months before, collapsed with stunning speed. The Germanic peoples who had been forced to serve the Huns reasserted their independence. The surviving Huns retreated eastward, back to the steppes, fragmenting into smaller groups. Some remained in the Pontic steppes, others migrated further east, but as a unified political and military force, they ceased to exist. The speed and completeness of the collapse is remarkable and reveals something important about the nature of Attila's empire. It was fundamentally a personal creation, held together by his individual leadership, rather than by institutions or shared identity. The Huns as a people did not see themselves as empire builders in the Roman sense. They were conquerors and extractors of tribute, but they never developed an administrative system that could survive their leader's death. There was no Hunnic bureaucracy, no legal code, no system of succession. Power went to whoever could claim it and hold it by force. For the Roman Empire, the collapse of the Hunnic threat came too late to save the Western Empire, which was already in its death spiral. Ironically, the Huns had played a crucial role in maintaining some stability in the West. Their presence had kept various Germanic tribes in check, and the tribute they extracted had actually been less damaging than the constant warfare that followed their collapse. With the Huns gone, there was nothing to prevent the final fragmentation of the Western Empire. Aetius, the general who had defeated Attila at Chalons, was murdered by Emperor Valentinian in 454. Valentinian himself was assassinated in 455. The Vandals sacked Rome that same year. The Western Ramang Empire would limp on for another 2 decades, but its fate was sealed. Attila's legacy is complex and has been interpreted in strikingly different ways by different peoples. In Western European tradition, he became the archetypal barbarian destroyer, the scourge of God sent to punish Roman decadence. Medieval chronicles portrayed him as an instrument of divine wrath, and his name became synonymous with savage cruelty. This image was reinforced by centuries of repetition until Attila the Hun became shorthand for brutality and destruction. But other peoples remembered him differently. In Hungarian tradition, despite the fact that Attila was not ethnically Hungarian, and the Huns disappeared centuries before the Magyars arrived in the region, he was adopted as a national hero. Medieval Hungarian chronicles claimed descent from Attila's Huns, and he was portrayed as a great king who had made Hungary feared throughout the world. Statues of Attila adorn Budapest to this day. In Germanic legends, particularly the Norse and Germanic sagas, Attila appears as Atli or Etzel, a powerful and complex figure who is sometimes portrayed sympathetically. The Nibelungenlied, the great German epic, features Etzel as a generous and noble king, a far cry from the monstrous figure of Roman accounts. These varying portrayals reveal more about the peoples doing the remembering than about the historical Attila, but they demonstrate the enormous impact he had on European memory and imagination. Modern historians have tried to pierce through the layers of legend and propaganda to understand the real Attila. He was clearly a brilliant military leader and strategist, capable of conducting complex campaigns across vast distances and keeping together a diverse and potentially fractious coalition of peoples. He was diplomatically astute, understanding when to fight and when to negotiate, skilled at extracting maximum advantage from Rome's internal divisions. He was ruthless. Certainly the accounts of cities destroyed and populations slaughtered are too numerous and consistent to be dismissed as pure propaganda. But he was also operating within the constraints and values of his culture and time. The Huns were a nomadic warrior people for whom raiding and conquest were normal economic activities, not crimes. The brutality Attila exhibited toward defeated enemies would have seemed no more remarkable to him than Roman crucifixions or the mass enslavements that followed. Roman conquests seemed to Romans. He was not uniquely cruel by the standards of his age. He was simply more successful than most in applying the harsh logic of 5th century warfare. What made Attila historically significant was not his personal character, whether good or bad, but the role he played in the transformation of Europe. The Hunnic invasions, which reached their peak under his leadership, were a major factor in the final collapse of the Western Roman Empire. By forcing Germanic tribes westward, by drawing away Roman resources to defend the frontiers, by demonstrating the vulnerability of Roman territories, the Huns accelerated processes that were already underway but might have taken longer to reach their conclusion. The world that emerged from the ruins of the Western Roman Empire, the world of medieval Europe, was shaped in part by the Hunnic invasions. The Germanic kingdoms that formed on the ruins of Roman provinces, the Frankish kingdom in Gaul, the Visigothic kingdom in Spain, the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, all owed their existence in part to the population movements triggered by the Huns. The Byzantine Empire in the East, which survived and flourished after the West's fall, had been hardened by its conflicts with Attila, its administrative systems strengthened, and its military tactics reformed in response to the Hunnic threat. It is impossible to say what would have happened if Attila had never existed, or if he had made different choices. Counterfactual history is always speculation. But certain things seem likely. Without the Hunnic pressure, the Germanic migrations might have been slower and less chaotic. Without the tribute burden and military costs of the Hunnic wars, the Roman Empire might have had more resources to address its internal problems. Without the demonstration of Roman vulnerability that Attila's successes provided, the various Germanic tribes might have been less bold in their challenges to Roman authority. But these are ultimately unanswerable questions. What we can say with certainty is that Attila was one of those rare individuals who appear at moments of historical transition and, through their actions, help determine which direction events will take. He did not cause the fall of Rome. That was the result of centuries of internal decay, economic problems, military pressures, and social transformation. But he hastened it, and he ensured that when the Western Empire finally collapsed, it would not be replaced by another universal empire, but by a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms that would eventually evolve into the nations of modern Europe. The Attila who emerges from the historical sources is a figure of contradictions. He lived simply but commanded vast wealth. He was a nomad who built a palace. He was illiterate, having no written language, yet he conducted sophisticated diplomatic negotiations with the empire that had created the Western world as greatest literary and legal traditions. He was capable of great cruelty, yet could show mercy when it served his purposes. He inspired fanatical loyalty from his followers, yet murdered his own brother to achieve sole power. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable thing about Attila was how much he achieved with relatively limited resources. The Huns were never a large people in terms of population. Even at their height, they probably numbered in the hundreds of thousands, a fraction of the Roman Empire's population. They had no technological advantages. Their weapons were no better than those of their enemies, and in some respects were inferior to Roman arms and armor. They had no economic base comparable to the agricultural and commercial wealth of the Mediterranean world. What they had was mobility, military skill, unity of purpose, and in Attila, a leader of genius who understood how to exploit his enemies' weaknesses and maintain his own people's cohesion. For a period of roughly 2 decades, from his assumption of sole power in 445 until his death in 453, Attila made the Hunnic Empire the most feared power in Europe. He brought both Roman empires to their knees, extracted tribute that amounted to a significant portion of imperial revenues, and came within a whisper of conquering Rome itself. That he accomplished this with the resources of a nomadic steppe people against the accumulated wealth and institutional structures of the Roman Empire is a testament to the power that a gifted leader can wield when circumstances align. But it's also a testament to the fragility of empires built on personal charisma rather than institutions. When Attila died, his empire died with him. Within a generation, the Huns had disappeared from history, absorbed into other peoples, or retreating back to the steppes from which they came. No Hunnic literature survived, no Hunnic monuments, no Hunnic legal codes or administrative records. What we know of them comes almost entirely from the accounts of their enemies, which means we see them through a distorted lens of fear and prejudice. The story of Attila is ultimately a story about the collision of two different worlds. On one side was the Roman Empire, ancient, sophisticated, literate, urban, agricultural, with centuries of accumulated wealth and culture. On the other side were the Huns, young, dynamic, mobile, oral, pastoral, with their culture carried in memory and song rather than in books and buildings. For a brief moment in the 5th century, the second seemed poised to destroy the first entirely. That it didn't, that Roman civilization in the East survived, and that in the West it was transformed rather than obliterated, was due in part to Attila's own death and the subsequent collapse of Hunnic power. But the encounter left its mark. The Roman Empire that emerged from the crucible of the Hunnic invasions was different from the one that had entered it. It was smaller, harder, more militarized, more willing to accommodate barbarian peoples within its structures. The Germanic kingdoms that succeeded the Western Empire were influenced by their years of contact with both Romans and Huns, creating hybrid cultures that combined elements of all three traditions. If we step back and view Attila's life from the broadest possible perspective, what we see is a man born into a moment of tremendous historical flux, a world in transition between ancient and medieval, between Roman and barbarian, between classical civilization and the successor cultures that would eventually become modern Europe. He did not create this transition forces, far larger than any individual were driving it, but he shaped how it unfolded. He accelerated some processes, diverted others, and left a legacy of destruction and transformation that echoed down the centuries. The cities he destroyed were rebuilt, or their refugees founded new cities. The peoples he subjugated eventually won their freedom. The empire he terrorized evolved or fell and was replaced by new political formations. But the memory of Attila persisted, growing and changing, with each retelling becoming myth and legend, a cautionary tale about pride and power, a reminder that empires, no matter how mighty they seem, are ultimately temporary, and that the future belongs not to those who cling to old certainties, but to those who can adapt new realities. Attila himself would probably have been baffled by his posthumous fame. He was a practical man, concerned with horses and weapons, with maintaining his warriors' loyalty and his people's power. He lived in the moment, each campaign planned for immediate advantage rather than distant legacy. The idea that people would still be telling his story 1,500 years after his death, that his name would become a universal byword, that children in countries he never knew existed would learn about him in school. None of this would have mattered to him as much as the simple immediate concerns of leadership and survival. But history had other plans. By being in the right place at the right time, by possessing the right combination of talents, by making the choices he made, Attila the Hun became more than just a successful warrior king. He became a symbol, a turning point, a moment when the old world gave way to the new. He became, as the Romans called him, the Scourge of God, not because he was uniquely evil or divinely appointed, but because he appeared at a moment when the old order was ready to fall, and he gave it the push that sent it tumbling into history. The earth that trembled beneath his horsemen's hooves on that spring day in 441 never stopped trembling. The waves of change that he set in motion, or rode, or accelerated, continued to propagate outward long after his death, reshaping Europe and indirectly influencing the entire world. The cities he threatened became the sites of medieval kingdoms. The peoples he drove westward became the founders of new nations. The empire he weakened collapsed and was replaced by the civilization we call Western, which would eventually dominate the globe. None of this was Attila's intention. He was trying to secure wealth and power for his people, to maintain his own position, to live up to the expectations of a warrior culture that measured a man by his deeds. That his actions had consequences far beyond his imagination or control is the nature of historical contingency. Individuals act for their own reasons, pursuing their own goals, but the results of their actions interact with countless other forces and factors to produce outcomes no one predicted or intended. Attila lived roughly 50 years, ruled with absolute power for less than a decade, and died in his bed in circumstances that remain mysterious. In that brief span, he terrorized half of Europe, brought empires to their knees, and earned a place in history that few conquerors have matched. He was not the greatest military mind of his age. Arguments could be made for generals like Aetius or Belisarius. He was not the most successful empire builder. His realm collapsed within months of his death. He was not uniquely cruel or destructive. The 5th century offered plenty of competition in that regard. What he was consequential. His existence mattered. The choices he made changed the course of events in ways that can still be traced 15 centuries later. In a world where most people, even most kings and generals, leave barely a ripple on history's vast ocean, Attila created waves that are still washing up on distant shores. And perhaps that's the final irony of his story. A man who left no written records, built no lasting monuments, founded no institutions or dynasties, whose people vanished from history within a generation of his death. This man is remembered when emperors with detailed biographies and magnificent ruins have been forgotten. The scourge of God, the terror of Rome, the king who almost changed the course of Western civilization, lives on not in stone or bronze, but in memory, in story, in the collective imagination of cultures he never knew. That memory may not be entirely accurate. The historical Attila was almost certainly more complex, more human, more understandable in the context of his time and place than the monster of legend. But the legend itself is part of his legacy, a testament to the impact he had on the peoples who encountered him and their descendants. For better or worse, truly or falsely, completely or partially, Attila the Hun has achieved a kind of immortality that he probably never sought and would perhaps not have valued. But we, his distant inheritors, living in a world shaped in part by his actions, cannot ignore him. To understand how we got here, to comprehend the forces that created modern Europe, and through Europe influenced the modern world, we must grapple with figures like Attila, not to glorify or demonize them, but to understand them as historical actors making choices in specific contexts, choices that echoed forward through time in ways both predictable and surprising. The story of Attila the Hun is not just the story of one man or even one people. It's a story about the end of one world and the beginning of another, about the fragility of civilizations and the power of disruption, about how individuals and vast historical forces interact to create the contingent, messy, endlessly fascinating process we call history. It is a story that begins with the thunder of hooves on the Roman frontier and ends with the quiet death of a conqueror in his marriage bed. But the echoes of that thunder and that death reverberate still.